Okay.
So now it's 9:31, Ryan. So I think we are good to start.
Should we wait for the number? We'll roll. People can keep joining, I guess. Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Ryan Edwards. I'm Deputy Director of the Development Policy Centre here at the ANU. As always, I'd first like to acknowledge and celebrate the First Australians on whose traditional lands we are respectively broadcasting from. For those of you unfamiliar with the centre, we are a research centre at the ANU focused on improving the effectiveness of Australian aid, supporting the development of Papua New Guinea and the Pacific Island region, and contributing to better global development policy. Welcome to today's Labour Mobility event. As many of you know, we've been running monthly Labour Mobility seminars and other Labour Mobility events for quite a while now. These events and well, just about everything that you see us doing on labour mobility, migration and Pacific economies is part of the Australian Government's Pacific Research Program. And we are grateful that they help to support us now and into the future in creating these important spaces for discussion and indeed self-reflection. Today's event is a special one. So it's not one of our regular labour mobility seminars. It's longer, not just 1 hour, but over two. You don't have one host, which is usually me, but you're going to get two, and they're not actually including me. I'm not the host today. So you're blessed. And there's not one speaker, but there's 6 speakers. And it was specially organised by our research fellow, Mike Rose. As always, please do note that it is being recorded. It's currently live streaming on our Facebook page, and it will be posted on our website after we're done, so you can refer back to it should you wish. We have 2 panel discussions this morning on labour mobility, with a focus on Timor-Leste. The first will feature researchers and be chaired by Mark Notaras, who is the founder and director of the Timor-Leste Food Lab and the Agora Food Studio. Welcome, Mark. And the second, we'll hear from current and former migrants themselves. And that will be chaired by Gordon Peake, our former colleague at the ANU, who's now of Georgetown and Washington, D.C. fame. The chairs will introduce each of the speakers in their respective sessions. And with that, I'll say goodbye and hand over to Mark to kick off the first session.
Cheers. Thank you very much, Ryan. As Ryan mentioned, we've got a pretty packed agenda today, so we'll move into it quite quickly. Just wanted to give a shout out and thanks to Arichika Okazaki for all the behind the scenes that's made today happen, and also Stephen Howes and his team at the Development Policy Centre with this, I think, unique session today, because I'm interested in this issue, as no doubt everybody is, and it's interesting that it's only sort of really come to light in the last few years how important the overseas workers and the income that they bring back to Timor has sort of come onto the policy agenda a lot later than a lot of people predicted or thought. And I think the interesting thing today from the findings that we'll hear, not only from the workers, but from the researchers who are hopefully channeling these back into policy is a chance to get a bit ahead and a bit more proactive on the policy that surrounds the workers and going out and coming back. And the title, Timor-Leste at 20, Money from Abroad, Dreams of the Island, sort of gives you a flavour for the fact that people do go out, but there's an income opportunity to bring it back to the country. And this is already next year, 20 years since independence. So there's going to be some interesting questions later. After we introduce our 3 panelists, there will be a Q&A session. As Ryan mentioned, we're going to keep it to questions and answers, not statements today, because importantly, we want to hear the workers on Gordon Peake's panel later after that. So to fit all that in today, we'll get straight into it with our first panelist and a good friend of mine, Dr. Michael Rose, who is a research fellow from the Development Policy Centre at the ANU, a colleague of Ryan's, and his paper, A Development Nexus, Remittances and Grassroots Development in Timor-Leste. I think it's over to you, Michael. And then after that, we're going to hear from Annie Wu and Professor Andrew McWilliam in that order. So over to you, Michael. Thanks again for everyone for coming. And I'll just, one final point from my side, feel free to populate the chat with questions from now, but just be aware that we'll also be taking questions later with a raised hand approach. But if you do put questions in the chat now, they will be seen by us for consideration in the Q&A session after the three speakers. So thanks everyone. Over to you, Michael.
Okay, Mark, thank you so much. I bet I need to unmute. Hang on. I'm muted.
Yeah, we can hear
you. Okay,
you
hear me?
Yep.
Okay, we're good. Okay, first of all, I must apologize because I'm tremendously nervous. So hopefully I won't be too incomprehensible. But let's just get started. Mark, thank you for that wonderful introduction. To all the participants in this sort of rather large event, thank you for coming. And to everyone listening in, thank you for making the time. And we look forward to hearing your perspectives on the research. Okay. Okay, sorry, I was just checking we had the right PowerPoint slide there. We're good. Right. Labour migration is going to matter to Timor-Leste's future, and the purpose of the research I'm sketching here in this quick, hopefully 20-minute talk is to feed into a conversation about what this future will look like. In setting out, it's worth noting, as did Mark, that this is not a simple discussion. No one is proposing that labour migration is the whole answer for Timor-Leste. No one is proposing that the situation there is hopeless and that all young people should go or anything like that. Rather, what I'm trying to suggest is that policies that give at least some of the population the option to work abroad, beginning with an expanded labour diaspora, will, to use a favourite Austronesian metaphor, give the country a rootedness in the world which it would not otherwise have had. An extra degree of security for those who stay at home, a new way of being Timorese for those who leave. Think of Malta, Ireland, Sicily, Armenia, Greece, small places marked for centuries by rich cultures and grinding poverty, whose identity is inseparable from their extensive diasporas, and have benefited both from the remittances of money and ideas and the reimagining of their identity in a global world. Okay, none of the above are models for Timor-Leste. Theirs are stories of a different age, but also all can be taken as inspiration. As Timor-Leste enters its third decade after the restoration of independence and its people look for new ways to be in the world. But to bring it back from Ellis Island to 2021, as many of the wonderful people in our audience are very well aware, the main game in Timor today, as I speak from the Development Policy Centre, remains the difficult domestic policy issues that people have grappled with for decades. Education, ease of doing business, attitudes to women and girls, nutrition, transport, telecommunications, urban design, domestic economic policy, debates on the role of ritual and religion. There's no aspect of Timorese domestic policy that outmigration will fix on its own, but at the same time, there's no issue in Timor-Leste that will remain unchanged by it. The model I'm sketching, this development nexus, is intended to be a tool for beginning to think about how the individual wage earning by Timorese abroad will shape and will not shape Timor-Leste's future. So I'm going to quickly sketch research background because this is a 20-minute talk here. My aim is more just to give a sort of idea of the breadth of the research and what I've been looking at rather than interrogate any particular part of it in granular detail. I think behind me here, you can see one of my great research assistants in Dili, Sisto Sarmento, interviewing someone for one of the surveys we did. My initial approach to this subject was formed during a year I spent as an advisor to Timor-Leste's Secretariat of State for Vocational Training and Employment, CEFOCPE, on behalf of the ILO in 2011 and 12. During this time, working in a Timorese government office, I saw firsthand how daily governance, although outwardly expressing patterns set during the Indonesian era, at a deeper level manifested distinctly local, in this case, meta or ikusi approaches to life. Later, seeking to understand this dynamic better, I returned to the island for a year of PhD fieldwork, also in Oikusi, seeking to understand how this balance of old and new shaped life in the present day. Time and time again, Timorese peoples have proved willing and able to adopting new technologies and new titles while maintaining a clear sense that whatever the outward appearances, it's still a certain it's still the old ways that order things. My current research as a fellow at the Australian National University's Development Policy Centre, funded by the Pacific Research Program, seeks to consider the applicability of these old patterns, referred to by Jim Fox as precedents to labour migration. The work has several different aspects. There's an ongoing mixed method study in Laltem district, which will include a survey of 200 households, combined with a year of participant observation conducted by a local research assistant. There's a multi-sited ethnography that spans 3 separate communities of Timorese workers in Australia and their families back in Timor-Leste. And finally, which is mostly what I'll be drawing on here in terms of hard data, there's an ongoing longitudinal study that, in addition to focus group discussions and formal interviews, has included a survey of 27 workers and 76 applicants who didn't make it to Australia in the Pacific Labour Scheme. As all of these projects are still in progress, my aim here is to draw from the conversations, observations, and initial survey data to give a broad sense of how remittances are making a difference to Timorese households. And then I will conclude with some questions for further consideration of the audience. So, remittance sending in Timor-Leste. Before I get into the results of the research and the model I've been using to understand it, I think it's worth quickly getting across the how and why of remittance sending from Timor-Leste. During the long struggle for independence, as Mark gestured to, the rise of outmigration was anticipated by pretty much no one. In thinking about why this has changed, it might be useful to begin with a slide put together by our good friends at Lau Hamotuk. There we go, the Timorese labour market. As you can see, only a very small percentage of the population is working abroad, about 2%. However, when we look at this in the context of the labour market as a whole, we begin to notice some interesting and important things. One is that 2% is about a third as many people who are working for the public sector, some 6%. And of course, that 2% is earning a lot more. In other words, although the number of Timorese working abroad is just a very small percentage of the population at the moment, especially compared with places like Nepal and the Philippines, they are increasingly influential. The other thing to take away from this chart is that the rest of the population are not doing nothing. Now, I will admit there have been times in policy circles in Australia where I've had difficulty trying to get people to understand this, and that's fair enough. I mean, if you were at the Department of Education, Skills and Employment in Canberra and you're looking at a chart that says 75% of the Australian population are outside the formal workforce, you would be justified in being a bit worried. However, things in Timor-Leste are very different. And the key difference is this. Although few people are being paid, also very few are idle. There's no shortage of work in Timor-Leste, there's just a certain shortage of paid jobs. What are people doing? They're looking after children, they're looking after old people, they're looking after dead people, that is to say maintaining graves and sacred houses. They're running little farms, they're running big farms, they're working for Chinese and Indonesian companies, they're fishing, they're gathering I wrote firewater there, but I think I meant firewood. They're selling pulsa. They're selling things at the market all by the side of the road. They're building houses. They're driving trucks. They're running local NGOs. It's a busy place. These activities are all that many people know. And these are things, all of them, that are easier to do if you have some sort of outside support, e.g. a relative in Australia or the UK. So what I think is needed in any conversation about outmigration from Timor-Leste is to remember that, rather than to sort of frame it as, instead of draining anything from Timor-Leste or eroding its identity, what outmigration seems to be doing in a very real sense is enhancing the capacity of those who have remained behind to continue doing what they've always done. But positive as that might be, there's no getting around that one of the things that is driving out migration is a lack of opportunities for the young. And later on, I think you'll hear Jomat and some of our Timorese interlocutors here describe that in detail. In the 20 years after independence, Dili has grown enormously, and its population is young and hungry, both literally and metaphorically. In 1998, Dili had 1 university. Now, depending on how you count, it has at least 7. I could be wrong there. Tell me if I am, but it's around about that. And although this has resulted in Dili becoming an energetic and intellectually interesting place, opportunities have also proved thin on the ground. The workers too I've spoken to and surveyed across Australia and in Timor-Leste mostly have university degrees. Indeed, later on in the seminar, you'll meet some of them. But perhaps even more significant than that, the workers being educated, is that in survey data, focus groups and conversations, the workers all tell me that they're also working abroad in order to help their siblings and children get more educated. The conclusion to be drawn from this is pretty clear. Regardless of whether or not their degrees are vocationally relevant, education, preferably to a university level, is what young people in Timor-Leste want. And I think it's worth pausing here to note something that has not consistently appeared in the qualitative aspect of my research, but which I do occasionally hear from foreign commentators. And that is that it's in some ways a pity that such educated young people are doing menial work abroad. Now, the groups I've been surveying and speaking to rarely see it this way. The fact that they're highly educated and globally connected just means that as they're doing their menial work, they're making increasingly elaborate plans for how they're going to spend the money. Some, the vast majority, would like to start a business. A full half would like to go on to further education. Some would like to migrate. None would be able to seriously contemplate any of this without the chance to make money through working in a rich country such as Australia or the UK. So, Timorese workers have different sort of jobs in a range of different countries, but the common element is that working abroad tends to be part of a broader strategy rather than a vocation in the sense that people might understand it in more developed countries. So just who are these workers and what are these programs they're using? Most are in the UK. For time's sake, I'll leave talking about that up to my colleague, Andrew. Some 4,000 are in South Korea. The Australian option, until very recently, when it was brought under the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility brand, PALM, had 2 main parts, which we'll stick with here. The Seasonal Worker Program, the SWP, and the Pacific Labour Scheme. In 2019, the Seasonal Worker Program had around 12,000 people from 10 countries, including 1,200 from Timor-Leste. Workers typically do 6 months to 9 months of harvest labour with the option of returning as they wish. I think the average return is about 4 trips. The PLS is much smaller, around 1,000 strong, but places workers in Australia for 3-year stretches. Like most of the other participants, the 100 Timorese in the PLS are mostly working in the meatpacking industry. As I said, both have been recently brought under a new brand, PALM, and there's been an interesting transition where it looks as though some of the PLS workers who've now been here for almost 3 years will have acquired enough on-the-job skills in Australia to apply for skilled visas that would potentially offer a pathway to PR. The situation is still developing, but it's certainly an interesting development. Alas, time is short, so we shall continue to, as promised, the development nexus. As you can see, in some ways, it's not that complicated. The idea is simple. When it comes down to how remittances are distributed in Timor-Leste, the extended family or clan is what matters most. The form of these family networks has changed with Timor-Leste's economic and political circumstances, but needless to say, it still forms a distribution network that extends nationwide. Admittedly, this is a generalization, but nonetheless, I think it can be argued that in Timor-Leste, what we might call customary communalism remains an important social norm. Layered on top of this, in terms of economic development, we find the deep influence of Indonesian ways of doing business and imagining material success. The Indonesian state justified its violent rule and occupation through the notion of bringing development to what had previously been a neglected colony. And for the 24 years the Indonesians were there, life in the territory was ordered by an incoherent and sometimes contradictory blend of security and development logics. Despite sustained and popular resistance to Indonesia's political control, Timor's urban and peri-urban areas were physically reordered along Indonesian lines and in many ways remain so today. Whilst in autonomous villages contributing to the common good, often meant providing labour at harvest time or brokering the transfer of symbolic wealth between households. In the present day, and this was a trend that started in the Indonesian time, obligations rooted in kinship networks more typically revolve around money, either used directly for buying food, building shelter, or acquiring prestige goods, or investing in education, healthcare, agriculture, or small businesses. The effect of remittances from abroad is the newest element within this system. Australian money distributed through Timorese family networks, furthering commercial enterprises and social investments that encode distinctly Indonesian ways of being modern. This is not a new development that's designed by friction or a case of people assembling new ways of being from scratch, but in my view, the addition of a new layer to a system that is both syncretic and distinctly Timorese. So once again, to sum it up in 3 sentences, Timorese frameworks for sharing, Indonesian influence models for commercial and educational attainment, individually earned capital from the UK and Australia. For those with an interest in what development spurred by labour migration is going to look like in Timor-Leste over the next 10 years, this is key. I will now move on to discuss one of these aspects in detail, customary communalism, before concluding with a few questions for the audience's consideration. Customary communalism. In discussing customary communalism in Timor-Leste, or adat, as we sometimes gloss it as, using an Indonesian loanword, it is important to note that what we talk about here is a shifting social fact rather than a fixed way of life. Within Timor, of course, there are constant debates over the importance of tradição, adat, communalism, and its proper role in society, not to mention a great deal of individual variation in who believes what. But when it comes to, nonetheless, if our survey data is anything to go by, the ethic of giving back to the family is clearly still very strong. In terms of people who are in Australia or who want to go to Australia, pretty much everyone remits or would remit. When it comes to custom and work abroad in Timor-Leste, 2 aspects are of particular importance. The first is the relationship between bride-taking and bride-giving families, which usually involves the ongoing provision of wealth and assistance from the former to the latter. The second is the ethic of intragroup aid, the often deeply felt idea that one is responsible not just for one's own welfare, but for that of the wider family group. One of the most striking aspects of my research so far is that pretty much everyone acknowledges the importance of such giving, even if they don't always like it. When questioned about customary payments, all but 2 of the 91 people who responded to the question in our POS survey indicated that they had made some form of payments between January and July 2019. And as you can see, most of it was bride wealth payments, but people also gave money for traditional ceremonies and maintaining sacred houses. Payments averaged around $200 and were mostly, as I said, in the service of bride price. Now, in the second stage of this longitudinal survey, it's going to be interesting to see if this attitude has changed amongst people who spent time in Australia. The qualitative aspect of my research also yielded very similar results when I spoke to people. So whether the continued importance of customary giving is seen as a negative or a positive from a development perspective is, as we academics like to say, beyond the scope of this paper. There are certainly good arguments for and against it. However, even at this early stage, it can be taken as a good example of how the money earned abroad, including in Australia, feeds into Timorese customary practices. From a policy point of view, it's difficult to know exactly what to do with this. The details of gift-giving, feasting in Timor are lodged in lived experience and potentially, arguably, not really that accessible to outside commentators. Nonetheless, what is clear is that custom or adat, communalism, is the mechanism through which money earned individually passes into Timor's social economy. The proper role of custom is a debate, in my opinion, for Timor-Leste. For foreign actors with an interest in development in Timor-Leste, I believe it's enough just to be aware that such a system exists, if only so to avoid the mistake of trying to construct a parallel one.
Mike,
Okay.
just letting you know, we're a couple of minutes left.
Yep, okay, no worries, we should be good. Distinct from customary giving, although related to it, is the more generalized obligation to assist family members in need. In virtually every semi-structured conversation I had with workers in Australia, families in Timor, I heard similar comments. For most households, the greatest expense was food, another one was education, and another one was housing. What is interesting about this, but doesn't show up in the survey, but did in discussions with workers, was the motivation behind it. Interlocutors saw supporting their siblings and parents not simply as a duty, but a reason for being. So once again, Timorese customary communalism has shown itself to be a deeply felt and pervasive redistributive system. The question for Australian policymakers is how we might say, enhance its capacity by allowing Timorese workers greater opportunities to earn money abroad. And now we're moving on to our last page and the conclusion. I would have liked to have spoken more here about Indonesian influences on Timor-Leste's system of education, governance and commerce, as well as its material imaginaries, but time has gotten away from me. In some ways, though, having noted the importance of customary communalism and the pervasive influence of Indonesian commercialism, the really important question is how the addition of individual wage earning abroad into this mix is going to change things. We can already see that the money tends to be distributed rather than saved. This is the nature of a collectivist system. We can also see that although innovations occur all the time, there is a fairly well-worn path for it being used. The result is lots of small-scale economic activity that is reminiscent of that which occurs in Eastern Indonesia. What is perhaps more interesting, though, are the questions that are unanswered. Historically, in Timor, it's been those who are older and male that make the big decisions, but what happens when it is a younger man or a woman who holds the purse strings through working in Australia? Historically, Timorese ways have been very flexible in the way of new economic and political regimens. Will this continue? Another question. What are the roles of social remittances? We've discussed Timor-Leste already. As we've discussed, Timor-Leste already has a functioning set of conventions that guide how governance, commerce, and education work. Many of the workers I would speak to would comment on how a different order prevailed in Australia. The emphasis on punctuality, the impersonal nature of the contract between employer and employee, the autonomy of the individual to make their own choices about their own money. To what degree are these new ways being brought back to Timor-Leste? We just don't know for sure. In terms of development policy, what sort of opportunities are inherent in the presence of this nexus I've just described? Once again, the picture is still emerging, but in my opinion, two things are clear. One is the Timorese people are completely capable, without substantial help from government or NGOs, of using the remittances they earn to steer development in a way that makes sense to them. And the way they do this stems from a system with deep roots in the island's history. The other is that if more Timorese are given the chance to work, and in some cases potentially settle in Australia, more of this development will happen. I began this paper by noting that this is a complicated debate, but the question Australian policymakers need to be asking themselves is a relatively simple one, and it is this. How can we open the door wider to Timorese workers, and how can we make sure they're treated well whilst they're here? As I hope I've shown in this brief talk, Timorese families are more than capable of managing the rest. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Mike, for that, packing so much into that talk, particularly economic, social, cultural context, which will also be relevant for the findings of our next two speakers. So I'm going to hand over to Dr. Annie Wu. She's an assistant researcher at the University of Technology, Sydney, in the Arts and Social Science faculty in the School of Communication there. Unlike Mike, whose research over the years I know has focused on, not exclusively on, but on workers who've come from the furthest parts of Timor-Leste, both Los Palos in the east and Akusi, the exclave within West Timor. Annie's focus is more on, or fieldwork has been in Dili, and also on the seasonal workers. So we'll hand over to Annie for her 20-minute talk. As I said, any questions can go in the chat including who your questions may be directed to. But over to you, Annie, for now.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. So for my presentation, I would make a little bit distinction from what we have heard from Mike, but somehow is quite similar. We have the very similar aspect in regards of talking about the social impact and geographic impact of remittances. Just let me share my PowerPoint. So from my aspect, my name is Annie, and I research on the Australian seasonal workers from Timor-Leste since 2016. So this part of the research was derived from my PhD with the School of Geoscience back at the University of Sydney until 2020. Most of my research was gathered from the empirical work before the pandemic, which was until the end of 2019. Well, I stayed in Dili until 2019, so the relevant human geographic approach was applied to the multi-scalar household survey, and the multi-site ethnography was completed both in Australia and Timor-Leste. From this part of a ethnographic approach, I interviewed 50 households in total. Each household in Timor-Leste would at least have 8 to 10 members in a household. So in total, I interviewed over 500 people during that 3.5 years duration. In that case, I actually have the multi-scale data from the urban side of Dili and on the eastern side of Los Palos until like the southern side of VKK. I gathered quite a large number of data. But in this presentation, I would just like to focus on more of the aspect of urbanization in Dili. So I entitled it as the life after migration. So the migration is being argued in as the variables to discuss the urbanization process for Dili, and how does that part of the migration experience could be rendered as the mobility element to be fit into the development policy and the further social mobility in the Dili's context. So for the remittances received by households in Timor-Leste has made a very significant difference to the development. When finance is no longer an issue for seasonal workers, their savings give them the opportunity to access resources they have not been able to get before the migration. Among interviewed seasonal workers, 1/3 of them chose to live in Dili after their migration, regardless where they have been from. And the financial capitals they have been establishing lives in a capital city or prefer the convenience of career choices in Dili has made a really big differences. These participants who chose to live in Dili had said, schools in Dili are better for my children, or they are good Portuguese schools, and I want to start my own business, and Dili is better for that. Also, other interviewees have remained in rural areas were content with the lifestyle with the existing social networks, and they have the existing farming system, while remittances was only reinforced their purchase in new land or improving the standard of livelihood in the district. These are also very profound to know. Some of them were working in regional Australia while consistently sending the remittances back to Dili, also their native district. So the livelihood of both districts and capital Dilis are able to maintain in a sufficient level. And many returnees has physical assets, such as remittances and properties, that traditional professional workers do not easily achieve without a long period of accumulation or through the close-knit network in their upper class circle. Remittances allowed longer-term investment to be possible. That would be back to what Mike was saying. That would be rendered the development outcome. And this expenditure is an important index in identifying the middle class in a gradual capitalism immersed Dili. Rather than the personal attainment of the traditional professionals in Timorese society. So on a personal level, the emergence of a middle class from this circle shot does not only show the flow of cash or remittances, but it would actually indicate what would happen in a social and geographic landscape after the remittances influx. So what is urbanization? As a human geographer, I tend to think about things from the landscape. So urbanization does not only mean we wipe down all the such house and build it all concrete jungle, concrete buildings, or like this photo I've put in on is Timor Plaza. So from the little lovely house in VKK to the Dili giant building of Timor Plaza, that's not only signifies the urbanization in progress, but a way of how we define capitals. And the social mobility and spatial mobility can actually offer a greater prospect to broaden the horizon through the cultural observation and cultural absorption in another society that has had the long-standing effect upon the mentality and social behaviors of returnees. What I mean was those workers' immersion of Australian culture and Australian way of consumption, those tastes in consumption and the purchase decisions of returned Timorese migrants from Australia were affected by their overseas living experience in Australia. Therefore, more infrastructure would definitely emerge in the community to suit the consumption needs of newly emergent middle class. For instance, we have the ownership of livelihood, such as livestock, farm, crops, and other natural resources as one of the capital in a district. In the urban space, we would have the buildings such as 5-star hotel or Timor Plaza, the very standardized tarmac roads with the traffic light. Traffic lights are not that common in Timor, and more public infrastructures are coming in along with the process of urbanization. The way we would define capital and livelihood has been transit to a different way from rural to urban space. What is considered as feasible capital in the district, which might no longer be easily obtained or available in Dili. And this would be the way how we define what is valuable in terms of different landscape in both the rural context and the highly metropolitan context in Dili. I would really say the landscape change is the most significant part of urbanization. If anyone has had a live in Dili or visited Dili for some time, there was actually no road light on the street. I remember I used to live in Comera. That's one of the suburbs in central Dili. Still, there was no light after dark. So the power of my small torch has been a crucial part to sustain my nightlife when I was hanging out with my mate out there. There were more and more places with the proper infrastructure that would improve the general welfare and livelihood of the Timorese. But there were still the push and pull factors to prompt the people use the small consumption power to change the landscapes from the nature-driven waterfall to the more man-made infrastructure in a public space, like from the picture I put on with the waterfall I photoed in Okusi. And on the right-hand side, I pop up the other way of another side of Okusi has been really being wiped out that part of the nature landscape, but replaced by the modern development with the flat roads, and people were starting to getting used to that part of the modern infrastructure will be gradually coming into the area where they were used to be pretty much the nature landscape. So there's a push and pull factors between rural area and the Dili, or even from the rural area to the capital part of municipalities. More returned seasonal workers move up to Dili after the migration in Australia, but there were also some workers, they choose to only move from their own native village to the capital cities of municipality and expand their entrepreneurship and networks. However, the landscape changes does not really signify lots of means of production change. The production changes are the key factors, and there's not completely inconsistent with the Marxist tradition of a capitalist, as they are where workers were meant to provide their labor for production, or they were the sellers of their means of reproduction, has been changed from selling the agricultural products to the vendor of their own service and knowledge. So the emergence of the seasonal workers program have given those well-educated and professionally trained youth a chance to demonstrate their ideas, ambitions, and skills by the influx of remittances. The great ideas are meant to support by the proper finance. More workers made up of their mind to engage in the entrepreneurship once they relocated to Dili. We could see this from the photo of the left-hand side. That was what I photoed in Los Balos. The older man was selling the tomato, and there was actually no price tags. So the price are negotiable, and there's an uncertainty for Malay foreign women like me to negotiate the price. But while you move to the Dili capital area, you could see this main difference was the price was fixed in supermarket. So that part of standardization and that part of the unification of the price would actually get rid of the certainty, and that part of very adventure part of commercial market, what you would get what you see, or what you would get something very uncertain. So making a huge difference between the pre-capitalist society and the capitalism immersed society. So when the means of production changed, more workers will make up their own mind to engage in entrepreneurship, because that's something is predictable. The profit therefore was predictable. On the one hand, these seasonal workers returnees were considered by other community members in Timor-Leste as very professionally educated. Most of them, as Mike had mentioned, got a university degree. They were pre-middle class, and when they when they have been immersed by the Australian working experience, they return. Their ambitions and existence were deprived due to the insufficient opportunity to exercise their ideals, and plans in the social environment were no longer the case. They have been the middle class who have had the sufficient ideas and sufficient funds to exercise their ideals and plans in the social environment after they accumulated a certain amount of remittances. Return workers' anticipation of seasonal workers program gave them the power that might build their capacity to break down the existing hierarchy of Timorese societies that have had been formed by the heritage or racial links. The formation of urban drilling and the associated economic activities, followed by an increase in income, has a more obvious influence in remittances recipient household compared with non-remittances recipient household. Prior to the 1975, I'm just going to give a little bit data. Dili accommodates more
Annie,
than.
just letting you know, Annie, sorry to interrupt. Just 3 minutes left on your side. Just letting you know.
Okay. Was that 40 minutes of Timorese populations are from rural area. However, that data until 2012, while international remittances serve as a particular means of breaking through the class barriers geographically, the social impact of migrants' urban residents has been significant to the 70%. So from that number, we could definitely see as migration as a catalyst to the development of urbanization. The newly emerging middle class, followed by the certain gain of finance to the employment. This is going to be something that could be the key factor to make the urbanization progress possible. And from my empirical fieldwork finding, remittances for the better housing and access has a really giant impact in some part of the districts and the suburbans in Dili, such as the traditional house has been really wiped out and replaced by the modern housing of solid concrete materials, or from the accessible water. Some return workers had resided in Dili before their circular migration, and the access to water resources, it has been a very significant factor to find the better housing condition for a lot of return seasonal workers. While the guarantee of a water access is significant in most of the cases, having a better capital could guarantee the better spa and more convenient access to the water tank. So, such as this picture, one of my participants had built a house just beside a water tank, and therefore they don't have to queue for half an hour every morning to get water access. So on the mobility part, the remittances would definitely allow the longer term investment, while the very suitable material to get the heat off the ground was to use the tile building in the house. But for the mobility parts, not everyone could afford those concrete or tiles to build a new giant house. The most convenient way would be purchasing a car or the truck. Be a regular traveler from the Dili to the rural district. So for the physical mobility perspective, seasonal workers who have possessed the sufficient capital, they might choose to purchase the vehicle or the trucks to guarantee that part of physical mobility, once the social mobility and geographical landscape and locality was still unable to change due to the insufficient capital accumulation. A vehicle, a car, might be the best way to guarantee that part of the remittances outcome.
Annie, just sorry to interrupt, Annie. Just letting you know that the 20 minutes is up. If you don't mind wrapping up now, so we can enable enough time for questions and participant panel later. Thank you.
Right. So the final concluding remarks I would go into was the consumption was making the differences. Remittances really given that opportunity for the return seasonal workers to guarantee the better consumption and the living quality for the life. So from the development perspective, the consumption has been guaranteed for the seasonal workers to distribute the remittances and to reach that punctuality and autonomous of the consumption decision, which will shift the power of the dynamic from the head of a household to the seasonal workers themselves, give them the agency to develop the quality of life they designed for. Thank you for everyone's attention. I think we will discuss more in the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annie. We appreciate it. It's very difficult to cover everything in the short time. Yes, if there's any questions directed to Annie, please put them in the chat there and we'll get to them after our third speaker, and straight to Professor Andrew McWilliam, Professor of Anthropology at the Western Sydney University. His paper and talk on Making Money, Missing Home, Experiences of Timorese Labour Migrants to the UK, you can hear in the title, will be a contrast to the experiences that Mike and Annie have shared from Australia, but there will definitely be some overlaps there. So over to Professor Andrew McWilliam. Thank you.
Thank you, Ari. Good morning, everyone. Pleased to be here. I'm going to give a presentation on a different kind of labour migration that has been occurring out of Timor-Leste. And it's a precursor in many ways to the Australian migration experience. And for that reason, I think gives some interesting comparative perspectives on how labour migrants generate savings and what they do with remittances and what are the impacts over time. The UK migration attracted very large numbers of young Timorese migrants. Many more than thousands of people have taken that journey. And importantly, it was informal in the sense that it had no government involvement. It was a kind of spontaneous thing that grew over time, which makes it difficult to monitor in some ways and difficult to get a good handle on the statistics of who's involved in the process. But it flourished for more than 2 decades in Timor-Leste, and it generated significant benefits, but especially for the families who were participants in the migration process. And it continued right up until the onset of the COVID epidemic, which has pretty much disrupted the whole process. And there's big question marks over whether the kind of migration that we saw occurring in 2019 will be resurrected, and particularly in the context of the post-Brexit regulations in the UK. But I'll talk about that in a moment. What I'm going to talk about is a survey of 70 returned migrants and looking at their reflections and impacts of their experience. So let me begin with a brief outline of, brief outline of the UK migration experience. And I see there's basically 3 phases. The origins come from student activists during the occupation of Timor-Leste back in the late 80s as part of the clandestine front in the struggle for independence. And after the Santa Cruz massacre, the Indonesian security forces had a significant crackdown on these activists, which forced many of them to flee into western parts of Indonesia under the protection of the then newly formed Remittances student resistance movement. And subsequently, hundreds of Timorese migrants sought political asylum in the embassies of Jakarta, and most of them found their way to Portugal. And from there, a small group ended up in the UK for reasons which I won't go into at this point, where they continued their resistance struggles, particularly out of London, Oxford and Liverpool, where they had sympathetic supporters. This formed the nucleus of the informal migration to the UK. And it started to pick up steam, particularly with independence. There was a gradual increase of the numbers of people moving to the UK, importantly travelling on Portuguese passports, because anyone born prior to independence, Portugal recognised as a Portuguese citizen, and you could get access to a Portuguese passport, which in turn gave you free access to the labour market of the UK under the EU free movement policies. There, they undertook a whole series of low-skill, minimum wage shift work and in service industries, and over time started to generate significant savings and remittances. The third phase, from about 2010, was a real expansion. Sorry, I should say, one of the reasons why the migration was relatively slow early on is because in some ways the ability to secure a Portuguese passport was very constrained, and you needed to have contacts in Lisbon who could sort of shepherd the process through the Portuguese bureaucracy. That meant that only certain people with the right sponsors, who were former Timorese who'd taken up residence in Portugal, were able to get access to these passports. Over time, there was a democratization of the process so that more and more people could get access. And after 2010, there was a big upsurge based on my own work in this area. And I see a number of key elements that contributed to that. The first was the dramatic expansion of the internet and social media, which allowed many of the people living in Timor-Leste to see what was happening with their siblings and cousins in the UK. And there was a much greater communication between the two, which laid concerns and suspicions about people in Timor about what was happening in the UK. That was part of it. There was also a deregulation of airfares, which allowed much cheaper travel to go across the other side of the world. So it expanded dramatically into thousands of people really ending up in the UK. Now, just how many is still a matter of debate. I note here that there were, in the 2015 census in Timor, reportedly 5,350 Timorese living in the UK at the time. That's how I interpret the data anyway. But that doesn't account for thousands, perhaps, people who were in Timor-Leste having returned briefly or for holidays or a period of time back home. So the numbers could well be double that or more involved in this migration process. Let me say something about the survey results then. I'm trying to capture general patterns of migration practice and experience. All the respondents were Whakaluku, who were a very significant group within the migrants to the UK for the reasons I've kind of explained. They were the kind of first people to get access in many ways to this passport route. There were 70 responders, 20% in Dili, 80% in Los Palos. And the idea of the survey was that they were returned migrants, which I'll talk about in a moment, a bit more. Consistent with many surveys on migration, most of them were young, most of them were male, with only 10% female. One of the reasons for that is, I think, mainly concern among parents for allowing daughters to travel halfway around the world, even with chaperones, cousins and siblings who look after them. And although that's changing to some extent, it still seems to me that concern remains difficult for women to take up the migration option, labour migration. So the majority worked in England. About 17% went to Northern Ireland, which has been a popular place, partly because initially it didn't require strong or even any English language capacity. And so there's quite a large community being settled there, and expanded into Scotland more recently. So let me give you some data here on the results of my survey. So this first one is about years spent away, years spent during the migration. And you can see that, so people were away for relatively large lengths of time. And I think that's a reflection of partly the need to spend more time away earning income, generating sufficient income from the low-wage work that they were doing. But it also shows that there were limited options in Timor-Leste for alternative kinds of work, especially work that generated the kind of money that they could. I'll move on here. An important, I think, an interesting area that had become more popular in Timor, partly as a result of these cheap airfares, were increasing numbers of migrants return trips, making return trips to Timor-Leste to visit families. In some respects, there's a correlation between the length of time overseas and the number of trips they make home. But it had become a very common practice in many ways for people who were in established jobs in the UK to take their annual holidays on a flying trip to back home, whether that's Los Palos, Dili, or wherever, and spend some time with family, engaging in the social relationships of family and the kind of customary communalism that Mike talked about earlier, before heading back to do more work. And there's those three factors here that I mentioned enabled these people to do it. The importance of reliable internet and communication connections is very significant here, I think, in terms of engaging the labour migrants halfway around the world with their families in Timor-Leste. In the old days, there was a big gap, and the communication, as we know, using scratchy landlines was very inadequate. But with kind of direct and automatic access through a whole series of platforms, people engage and become what I've called translocal kind of identities here, that they're engaging all the time with the life back home and life in the migration space. And that's given people a lot more confidence to continue their relationships, basically. There were these cheap airfares. And another factor here I just mentioned is romances online. One of the consequences of reliable internet is that there was a kind of blossoming of love online between mainly men in the UK and their girlfriends in Timor-Leste. And this resulted in a lot of betrothals, people wishing to marry. And so sometimes, and I saw a number of cases of this, and I've heard a lot of examples of it, that people would come back for that month holiday and have set up a whole series of processes to fast track a marriage agreement, whereby if they did the requisite kinds of exchanges and feasting processes, the couple could depart at the end of the month with the blessings of their parents, and the man and wife would head back to the UK to resume migration life over there. This was one way in which I think many young women in Timor-Leste managed to get access to living in migration. Oops. So remittances, we've heard a little bit about this. Let me just say something more about it. The great majority of people report sending remittances home. 53% spend about $300 to $500 per month. So it's quite significant in Timorese terms. And the access people had to the money was sent through Western Union transfers, or importantly, I think, and this has been underreported to some extent, many people when they returned carried a lot of cash in their bags because they didn't want to pay the fees that Western Union charged. So there was a significant amount of income coming back to those source communities and source households. Just how much money came back is also unclear in many ways that we can attribute to remittances from the UK. One number which is quite strong from 2015 was that there was in that year $18,700,000 US dollars was remitted, which given that scale, which was very significant in terms of non-oil revenue, had very substantial benefits for the recipient households. The other point I'd make is that many of the UK migrant workers saw their efforts over there as a kind of sacrifice for the benefit of the family. So, and many of the qualitative research I've done has highlighted that, where they compare their kinds of work in these kind of routine and continuous shift work in a kind of grey and cold UK, they saw that as sacrificing themselves for the future of their family and the future of the nation, indeed, in a broader perspective. Now, just a bit more on where these remittances went, and it's very similar to what Mike and Annie have talked about. Significant, and this is a reporting just where the remittances were directed without adding to 100% or whatever. Many of the migrants funded consumption in the Timor-based families, particularly to purchase rice. That was a strong finding among most of the recipients. Significantly, in places like Los Palos, for the urban aldea communities, this funds for consumption in many ways replaced the need to cultivate crops for agriculture. So a lot of the people in Los Palos stopped farming effectively and lived off remittances. Other aspects were, as Danny has spoken up, the need to and the importance given to repairing houses and rebuilding houses, which I'll talk about in a moment. There was a lot of cultural gifts for exchange obligations, to what Mike was talking about. A lot of requests requests for cash were directed to migrants living in the UK so that they would provide a contribution to a funeral, provide to weddings, to other kinds of ritual events, which form the kind of vibrant life of the household and the community. The other area that was highly important was education of siblings as a kind of responsibility on the migrant, as part of their duty in a way, when they had money, was to contribute to the costs of their younger brothers and sisters. And we saw from Mike some of the impacts of that. Right, so I want to just give you a visual perspective on that. In Los Palos particularly, the housing was pretty grim at the end of occupation, people living in split bamboo houses that you see there with corroding tin roofs and dirt floors. And there was a really strong desire for people to live in better accommodation. So a lot of the migration remittances have been channeled into improving housing. And you see at the bottom right corner there, the guy in front of this house, it was produced after 1 year of work in the UK. It cost about US $5,000, and it's built to a kind of lock-up stage, and certainly not finished in any sense, but it gives you an indication of the terrific benefit that flowed to particular families who could have a family member working in the United Kingdom. And it just showed you how the kind of evidence of that, the physical material evidence that people saw in places like Los Palos, was another motivating factor for other families to try and get family members overseas. As Mike also talked about, there's a really high importance placed on fulfilling exchange obligations to kin and to a final group, so marrying your in-laws, as it were. And this involves contributions of different kinds, of animals, livestock, cash, in different ways. Another important area that people have channeled remittance funds into has been the restoration and rebuilding of graves of relatives and ancestors, those people who died during the occupation and there was not enough resources around to give them a proper burial. So they've come back and they're putting significant resources into rebuilding graves. They're also seeking to honour what they call the martyrs and heroes of the resistance struggle. And so a lot of the Frettl and Fallentil fighters who died during the struggle have had their graves elaborately developed. And much of this money has come from UK remittances. Now, sort of a few more slides. We asked them what was their employment situation on return at that stage. And you see there that 74% were unemployed. They said they didn't have any paid work as such. And I take Mike's point that they were clearly not sitting around doing nothing, but they weren't in paid employment. And what's the other point to make here is that is the question of savings as opposed to remittances. And what's interesting here is that say 50% of migrants return with about $5,000 or less. that they'd saved in addition to the remittances. But 14% had returned with more than $20,000. So we see here that some of the migrants were able to save very substantial amounts of cash. And even if you return with $5,000, that would allow you to live comfortably without paid employment for a year or more, perhaps, in places like Laotem, Los Palos. And because the survey we had was a snapshot of a particular time, it suggests that many of the younger migrants who had only spent a year or two away were coming back to Timor just for a visit, and it was likely that they would head off again, but they were stopped by COVID.
2 minutes, thanks, Andrew.
That's fine. And I just want to show you here. So the other point I'd make is that these people who generated large amounts of savings, the 26% 26% of people had some kind of income from the savings that they either invested or that they'd used to acquire a job. So some people had paid employment. It was very small, full-time jobs. The majority of people who had an income were people who'd invested the cash that they'd saved into particular businesses. And the businesses that were, what they looked around for was businesses that were viable. And a bit like Annie has said, that was mostly transport. You would buy a bus, for instance, to travel between Los Palos and Dili, or you'd buy some kind of vehicle that could be used as a way of generating income. But the real area for most people coming out of Los Palos was to invest money in infrastructure and housing, because there was a building boom in Los Palos from about 2012, and it was really the only economic activity in town. So I'll just show you this image that people who had the money would invest in the key elements of the building requirements, which are these cinder blocks for building the houses, these Mitsubishi Colt trucks, which they imported from Surabaya in Java, and they can access sand, and they were getting cheaper corrugated iron that was coming in through the Chinese trading markets. So for some, this was a big investment opportunity, and a few people in Los Palos made a lot of money. More people earned less money, but they were able to earn an income by building houses. And it said that, for instance, you could import one of these tip trucks for $30,000 US, and in the early days of the boom, you could pay it off in a year just by using it for haulage and renting of the vehicle. So it was the only real economic opportunity that generated income in Laotem during that period. I couldn't see much else that was of value in that sense. Now, finally, just let me make, we asked them to reflect on their experiences of the UK migration. 61% highlighted the money that they earned, the contenti ho'osa, that they were able to generate from that work, and they were particularly grateful that they were able to have that experience. The difficult aspects, they said, but the common sentiment was that they felt they were homesick for their families living far away. This idea of, and it was a real struggle for them in many cases to continue the work because of that distance. And the third one was their intention of returning to the UK for further work. And a very large number, 87%, were planning to go back to the UK. Now, they weren't able to do that at this stage, but it does signify that two things, I think. One is that there is simply no other option in somewhere like Los Palos, maybe less so Dili, more opportunities in Dili, but nothing much in Los Palos, where you could get some kind of alternative work that generated the kind of money they could. Simply not there, hasn't been there since the start of independence, really. And the other idea would be that people are returning to the UK because that's where they can, there was an assured way of generating income, which they could continue to support their families. So I suspect many of the respondents there were home temporarily. They weren't returned in the sense of finally staying there. They were just there briefly. And I'll leave it there. I'll just end with acknowledgement. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Professor Andrew McWilliam for sharing that very rich data set. We're tracking quite well with time here, so just a little sort of observation from my side. So I think we could see across all three presentations from Dr. Mike Rose, Dr. Annie Wu, and Professor Andrew McWilliam, that there have been very visible changes as a result of the worker programs and people coming back, investing in Timor-Leste. And we've seen that in terms of the infrastructure, particularly when you drive east in the country, you can actually see the physical build. I think what's less clear but is emerging more is the non-tangible changes, the skills development, the skills that people are bringing back. And we're very pleased that after our Q&A session, we will have a panel of Timorese current and former workers to share some of their stories and observations about how they've changed through this process. As we move into the Q&A now, I do encourage some of our Timorese friends and colleagues who are either existing workers or former workers. And also I noticed some people on the chat who are currently studying in Australia of Timorese background. Feel free to pop your questions into the chat as well. And if the questions come in Teton, we're able to translate those as well. I think, Ari, we have 20 minutes for this session before we hand over to Gordon. So we'll get straight into it in order of the questions coming in. The first one is for Andrew McWilliam. I'm not sure how relevant it is to this discussion, Andrew, but if you just wanted to address a question from Andrew Patterson, which I'll read out now, which is, did you look into the transition of expats who returned to Timor-Leste and their ability to reintegrate into local communities after long periods living in world cities? I suspect that you haven't, but did you want to just give a quick response to that, to Andrew on that? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mark. That's not something I've looked at specifically, but I would say my sense was that most people don't return to their source. They will end up in Dili. And that's one effect, I think, is that people don't see their future back in the village. For people who spend a long time overseas, they don't do that. There are some, and it's possible to make that transition back, but on the whole not. However, they continue the connection. They'll even say if they come back to Dili, they'll still have a strong connection with their home-based families, but they don't tend to stay there. If they do stay, they only stay temporarily and then they're off again. So there's been a pattern of the circular migration aspect has been quite strong.
Thanks, Andrew. Our next question will be from Charlie Shiner, who's raised his hand. Just a reminder, just one question per person so that many people can get a go, and no statements today, just to direct your question to the appropriate panelists. Thanks. Over to you, Charlie.
Yeah, my question is really for all three panelists. In the last few minutes, we've been talking a little bit about the Timorese who go overseas to work and come back or don't come back. But mostly we've been talking about the money they send back. And Timor-Leste is a country with a huge trade deficit and an unsustainable oil dependency. So my question is there a way that the workers who go overseas, and not just to Australia and Britain, but also to South Korea, can come back and play a significant role in developing the economy, developing local production, not just providing money to buy more imported materials? Thank you.
Who would like to go on that first? Michael, have you got some thoughts on that?
Mike, mute.
Unmute. There we go. That's a classic. I don't know if I really do have many sophisticated thoughts on that, but I can tell you who does, which is our Timorese panelists who are coming next. I think Simon specifically has set up and I don't know how you describe it, an organic chicken farm. So obviously, people who have been sort of around Timor would know of the notorious Brazilian chickens. I don't know the full economics of them, but these things were frozen in Brazil somehow and ended up in Timor. None of it made a whole lot of sense. And one of the very early things that every sort of development consultant was saying, that Timor-Leste has to develop a domestic sort of capacity to sort of raise chickens, make noodles, sort of make the simple things which were currently being imported. And what's sort of interesting to me, at least from this one example, which is admittedly just an example, is that although sort of government and NGO-led development hasn't succeeded in doing this on any large scale, what we are seeing now in some cases, and Simon's not the only one, is workers who have returned from abroad and have taken it upon themselves to fill that market gap, in this case, by providing sort of locally sourced chickens which taste better and are sort of comparable price-wise. So anyway, that's a very limited answer, Charlie, but thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Annie, did you want to add anything to that? On YouTube.
On mute. All right. Yeah, I'm back. I would say like just a follow-up point from Mike. Yeah, I would say that's really possible. From my empirical finding, most of the people that will move out from their native village to either Dili or the capital city of the municipality. And that's really something significant. Even though they move to the capital city, they don't cut off the ties of their native village. In that case, it's just a matter of a percentage. They might still devote the 30% of remittances to the native village and build up a new house or repair the cemeteries. So in that development perspective, I would say that the secondary migration from the rural area migrate to the urban area is still that part of a mutual beneficial things for both the rural village and the urban area. That's, yeah.
Can I make a quick
comment?
Yeah,
Andrew.
Yeah. Hi, Charlie. Good to see you. My response would be that the different people in the government have expressed a great desire that the migrants who return should contribute and work in Timor-Leste for the benefit of the country. The challenge is that, as we know, the private sector in Timor-Leste is extremely small, and there's not enough encouragement across any of the private sector, I would say, to really bolster it. And I mean, obviously the government is not going to employ return migrants in the public sector. So the real challenge is the private sector development, I think.
Sorry, can I just add one other thing very quickly? That it's also noteworthy that Timor-Leste is not an easy place to do business. In fact, it regularly comes down the very bottom of sort of ease of doing business indexes and things like that. And so in some ways, it's hard to blame people who have sort of earned money through extremely hard work abroad to risk it all on setting up a business when they don't know if they're going to get the right licenses, and there might be other sort of hazards like that. It's just a thought. So I think like there is definitely appetite for reinvesting money made abroad into businesses. Everyone talks about it. A lot of these guys are very sort of people are very well educated and full of ideas. I think what needs to change is that there needs to be a sort of domestic environment which is more business friendly. Does that make sense? I think it does to some extent. Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. And on that note, I think it would be really interesting a bit later to hear from Pedro Lay, his experience in this regard, because he's not only a current worker, but also someone who is running a business in Timor-Leste. And just to add to Mike's point, it is 181st, I believe, in the world, the most difficult place to run a business out of about 190 countries. So it's behind Syria and Niger and some countries like that. So it is a challenge. We've got two questions here. I might bunch them together from the chat to you, Andrew, because they have a UK focus. So Anne Wigglesworth has asked, it would be great to get more detailed data on the impact of migrants to the UK in the Timorese economy, especially that they save so much on a minimum wage, which UK people say is very difficult to live on. And she's also asking about the numbers of Timorese who are on Portuguese passports. Her understanding is that the number is much higher than that reported in the census. Do you have any current estimates of those numbers? And then a sort of related question from Vanessa Heerman. Could you speak about the impact of Brexit on the Timorese workers? Thanks, Andrew. And then after that, we'll have some questions from Michael Goodman, and I think Helen Hill is after that. So over to you, Andrew McWilliam.
Okay, I'll try and be quick here. Now, I guess the figure I would say, which is based on information out of the Portuguese embassy that I heard, and it's some time back, was 16,000 passports issued to Timorese. Now, there may be more, but that's one estimate. The difficulty of trying to get this data is that for a long time, the Timorese embassy in UK was not interested in people with Portuguese passports, even though they were citizens of Timor-Leste. And similarly, Portugal was not particularly interested either, because they were Timorese. So there was no real monitoring there's no, and in the UK even, they don't really have the right classification for identifying Timorese workers. So that's been a problem, I think, in trying to get a good handle on the numbers. And I don't have that. And I think it would be good to.
Did we just lose Andrew there?
Yeah, it looks like we lost.
That's okay. He'll
Yep.
pop back in. I hope that answers the question. Then there is a question from Michael Goodman on any possibility of Timor-Leste following the example of Mozambique by joining the Commonwealth. I don't know, Annie or Mike, if you know anything about that. If not, we'll just leave that until Andrew gets back. Any quick responses on that? Okay, then.
Right, sorry, I'm afraid I can't speak to that one. Yeah,
That's okay, no worries. Annie? That's okay.
Definitely not.
That's fine. We might go because we've got a question from Leonardo de Souza Rosa, and he's asked, how does this migration, either for seasonal workers or forming a diaspora in Europe, cause a brain drain in Timor-Leste? I think we can also apply that question, Mike and Annie, to Australia. Many educated people, he says, have also sought ways to acquire Portuguese passports to work abroad because of the lack of job opportunities in Timor-Leste. I think we're all familiar with that. But what are your thoughts on this question about brain drain, which is often one of the criticisms of these programs and the seasonal and labour migration schemes?
Could I say that brain drain is a further concern, but by the current migrant pathway to a permanent residency in Australia, it's still quite restricted for people who are in seasonal workers program. And I might leave it to Mike. For some of them, they apply for the refugee visa. However, in the current system, if they intend to apply for a Portuguese passport, according to some of my participants, they might take 2 years, up to 2 years, or even 3 years to wait for the passport. So from that perspective, it is definitely a concern. But by the time of being placed back to Timor for 3 years by waiting for a Portuguese passport, they could have done something. They could have provided job opportunities. They could have set up their own startup. They could do lots and lots of other things. And I don't think that would definitely be a brain drain thing. They still sort of contributing to the local economy in an informal way or even in a more official way. Yeah. So from the mutual beneficial perspective, it could actually render the further remittances influx, even though they might have the secondary passport. A lot of my participants, they might actually have contributed to the remittances by sending more and more back by the time they were living overseas for longer. Even though some of my friends I spoke to back in Timor, they might have had a diaspora background. In the last 20 years, their parents might have been sending the remittances regularly back to Timor. So that's part of the development impact in the long term. So we can't just simplify that's a brain drain or brain gain. Yeah, we might have the more nuances behind that part of developmental process by just acquiring a Portuguese passport.
I'll have a go.
Yeah,
Really.
thank you, Michael.
Yeah, thanks. Look, Annie, there's a lot of complex aspects to that issue, but look, I'll just keep it quick. In terms of brain drain, I think in the literature, often when we talk about brain drain, a lot of the bulk of that literature is about sort of highly trained professionals from places like Bangladesh and the Philippines, nurses, doctors, that sort of thing, moving to the UK, to Australia, to places where they can make more money in their professions, which obviously is, not a great thing. In the Timor-Leste situation, we're looking at something a little bit different in that although most of the workers have university degrees, there are pretty close to zero opportunities for them to use those degrees in Timor. Now, hopefully that situation will sort of improve. But I think one aspect of this is, which I argue about all the time, is that like you're only in Australia picking fruit for a short time. I mean, some people are looking to migrate, but it's this circular migration. The money you accrue, the experience you accrue gives you more resources to use your brains, so to speak, when you go back to Timor. You can do another university course. You can study abroad. You have money to start a new business. These are resources which an educated young person who hasn't worked abroad doesn't have. So in some ways, I mean, what we could be looking at really is brain gain rather than brain drain.
Thanks, Michael. I'm just getting the wind up from Maun Ari behind the scenes. So while we have Andrew back there, just a quick question from a quick response from Andrew to a question in the chat before I ask Helen Hill a quick question. Andrew, the question from Michael S. Goodman was, is there any possibility of Timor-Leste following the example of Mozambique by joining the Commonwealth? Just a quick response on that.
Okay, good question. I have no expertise to answer that question. I can't do it.
No worries.
But can I just answer that question on Brexit? I saw Anne had a comment in the chat, and I agree. The thing I'd add is that we knew Brexit was coming for a long time, but it's only been now when they implemented it that it's caused a kind of crisis for Timorese in the UK. If you hadn't registered as a settlement, you registered your settlement status in the UK by June of this year, then you weren't going to be allowed to stay. So the question is how many people made that deadline or not is unclear. From what I read, a lot of communities were assisting Timorese to get their documents filled in, because they don't have a great track record of filling in these things.
Cheers, thanks for that, Andrew. Helen, quick question from yourself before we wrap up.
Yes, one of the things I always wonder about the seasonal worker program in Australia is whether it could be used as a way of bringing together Timorese farmers and Australian farmers to discuss how the whole area of farming in Timor could be improved, because as Charlie's always reminding us, the oil is running out and the main resource of Timor is the land. And it's a bit worrying to hear that people in Los Palos have given up growing food because they've got money coming in. And don't forget, the Indonesians de-skilled farming, and none of these educated people want to be a farmer. And yet,
sure,
there would be great.
What's the question, Helen? Sorry, just as we're wrapping up, what's the question?
Well, because we wanted to, when I worked for the Ministry of Education, we recommended transforming the secondary agricultural schools into real schools for learning farmers, and to include as part of that curriculum a study tour to Australian farms funded by participation in the seasonal worker program. Because Timorese come back from Australia saying, we didn't know farmers could be wealthy. We saw wealthy farmers in Australia. Now, somebody's got to work on this whole discourse of the role of agriculture.
Definitely agree with that. I think, Helen, if you don't mind, we'll leave it there, because we are going to hear the workers' voices now. Just because we're getting the wind up here, if that's okay, if there are more questions from yourself, Helen, or anyone else, please leave them in the chat. Could
I just very quickly respond to Helen?
Quick one, Michael.
Yep, no worries. Helen, look, I think you're absolutely spot on with all of those comments. And I just don't have the answer to that. There is sort of talk about the seasonal worker program sort of incorporating more sort of explicit training elements. But it's the question of like how relevant the Australian agricultural experience is to Timor-Leste is a tricky one, to say the least. But look, thank you. You're absolutely right. Done.
Thanks for that response, Mike. Andrew or Annie, have you got any final comments to add from your side before we move on to the Timorese panel?
Yeah, I would just add on that part of cost and benefit. I found that part of slide different attitude from the returning seasonal worker. Everyone wants to be a boss. Well, when by those days living in Australia, they were being workers. But why not just being someone who has the power and has the capital when they were back in Timor-Leste? So they would be back to the agricultural sector and the farming village under the condition they are their own boss. They could be these owners, like farm owners, but they are not gonna be the farmers. Like, yeah, they just want to be their own boss when they accumulate the proper finance from Australia. That's part of the humanities, I would say. Thanks.
Just
Thanks,
a
Danny. Andrew?
final comment there. As Charlie Shiner and Lau Hamutuk have shown, the Timor-Leste government has underfunded agriculture consistently ever since independence. So a big change in agriculture could come about with changing policies for agriculture in Timor. Stop importing staple foods, start producing would be a kind of good start.
Thanks for everyone's comments. Mike, was there anything else from your side?
My Zoom is not working. No, I'm all good, ready to go.
That's great. Well, I can see my good friend Gordon Peak sitting in the forest there, waiting, edging to take this over. I just wanted to say thank you again to Stephen Howes and his team, and also neglected to mention Beth Orton before, who's been instrumental in setting these very valuable forums up. And now we're going to hear from the workers, including Jomat, who's put his comment in there, and also Pedro Lay, who's here with us. So over to you, Gordon Peak. Thanks very much for everyone.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. And thank you for giving me my new name, Gordon Panel. I've been called a lot worse. It's good evening, everyone. I'm in the East Coast of the United States, and it's probably a sort of example of the kind of globalized, kind of multi-connected world that we're living in, that we're able to have this conversation. I've got sort of questions that are coming up on the chat panel. I'm involved in a WhatsApp group that's been really active, talking about this as well. These different fractal views of information. I really enjoyed the three papers. I sometimes wonder if I should have been an anthropologist if I hadn't have done what I did. But one thing that often strikes me as missing in anthropology papers and missing in anthropology panels is the voices of the people that anthropologists talk about. And this is why I think this next panel that we have is going to be so rich and so useful, because we're actually going to talk to some of the people and put faces to names and faces to statistics from the people that Michael and Annie and Andrew have talked about. So we've got Pedro Lay here. Pedro and I know each other a little bit. I was lucky enough to meet Pedro when I was doing a podcast series with the Development Policy Center. We did 2 episodes on the seasonal workers program and the Pacific Labor Scheme. I'll put the link to that in the chat as well. But I wanted to begin by talking to Pedro, and then we'll go on to talk to some of the other people. And as Mark said, really, I'm happy to keep the conversation going, but it would be much better if we could get the views of people in on the chat. So please send your views, send your inputs, send your questions in on the chat function, and I will sort of sift through and curate them. Pedro, I'm from Northern Ireland, which has, I think, one of the largest Timorese communities in the world. Pedro, you spent initially your career there, then you moved to Australia. Can you talk a little bit, and we are both in different ways are immigrants. We're both people who spent a lot of our adult life outside of the country that we were born in. Can you talk a little bit about what the money that you've been earning working in Northern Ireland or working in Australia, how is that money being used? How do you use that money?
Yeah, all right, Mom. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. As you know, Mom, I've been in Northern Ireland since 2004 until 2011. And since that time, obviously I earned some money that can make me, help my family back home, like sending some of my siblings going to the university, paying their school, and set up some small business that I still keep it until now. So
what's the business?
Is before it was like a accessory shop for like a sticker for car.
Yeah.
And after a while, then I changed it to the printing shop, like printing on the paper, printing on and renting the computer to the student.
Okay, great. And when you think about the amount of people that the money that you're sending goes back to, is it 5 people? Is it 10 people? Is it 20 people? How many people do you think are being influenced or helped or have something that they would not have had without the money that you earned in Northern Ireland or in Australia?
Yeah, Mom. You know that Timorese is a big family, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Even in only one house, like brothers and sisters. I have 9 brothers and like brothers and sisters. So the money is really helpful, and I can help like more than 10 people, like directly to my family, my own family, and some other like a nephew or cousin. So I think is very, very helpful, and like the impact is big, you know, Mom.
Yeah.
Because by you setting up your small business, and you can help other also, like your neighbor also sometimes. So I think it's more than 10 people.
Yeah.
Bigger.
I want to ask you one question also about COVID. When we did a podcast, I said in the podcast that it's only when you're not from a country, that whenever the borders are closed, that you appreciate how far away your home country is. Ireland for me, Timor-Leste for you. Can you talk about the impact that COVID has had upon you and your ability? You're not able to go back and see your family. You're not sure when you're going to get back to Timor-Leste.
Yes, Mon. It's been hard, you know, just not only for me. I think it's for everybody. But it's been really hard because it's already 2 years that I cannot go visit my family. Even when my sister just passed away last year, I just cannot go there. You know, the Timorese have a very strong, strong feeling or strong bond between sibling, parent, uncle. But I not be able to go there just because of COVID. It's hard. But well, as like you know that the life is making us to like make a decision. Sometimes it's really hard, but we just have to pick, you know.
No, it's really, really hard. I can empathize so much, because we can talk to people on video calls, we can talk to people on Facebook Messenger, but it's not the same as actually seeing them in real life. So I'm going to move on. I'm going to talk to some of the other colleagues, then we'll come back. And as I say to everyone else that's listening in on this really valuable conversation, if you've got questions for Pedro, if you've got questions for some of the other participants that we'll talk to, please put them in on the chat. I think this conversation becomes richer and better the more people that are involved in it. So we've got Jomat and Simon Pedro that are in Dili. The other 3 people that we've got are in Dili. They're Jomat and Simon Pedro are in a place with a very nice. I think they've got the best kind of backdrop of anyone. Where are you guys?
Hi, good morning, everyone.
Where are you?
We are at my workplace, close to the Philippines and University Hub, which is currently the unit. And there's something that the Timorese often talk about in Teton about the hun, the base, the importance of things, and the being the base within which the root of a tree. And it's interesting when you look at the map that is behind us, how the importance of these kind of roots that take place as well. Simon, Pedro, can I begin and talk with you? You were working in Australia for a couple of years,
and then you came back to Dili and started a business. Can you talk a little bit about what the business is and how it's going?
Okay, thank you for the time. I'm Simon Pedro, everyone call me Simon. I'm from Bako municipality and I live in a rural area. So now I'm as an owner of Da Costa Farm. When I came from Australia, what I think to do in my country, I start to raising an organic chickens because after raising organic chicken, I survey the market, strategy market. I think the organic chickens, the most people they need to eat the organic chickens because it can good for their health. So now I start raising the chickens in my village in Osawala, when the place where my parents live. The product that I produce from the organic chickens, like DOC, day-old chickens, and the organic eggs, and the roaster, the roaster for fighting.
So did you do this? Did you do a business like this in Australia? Why did you start this business when you came back?
Okay. In Australia,
yeah,
I work for horticulture, and I earn some money. When I come back here, I want to make a self-employed for myself.
Yeah,
and I want to recruit some job for my family in my village.
Yeah.
And now I have two staff. My mother and my younger brother.
Yeah.
I give the job for them. So the product that we produce from raising organic chicken, now we already sell in the market, into supermarkets in Dili.
Right.
The first one is Loja dos Agricultores in Fatuhada. And the second one is Mimar Timor Plaza Supermarket.
Okay.
And the market is need more the products, but we still minus of the production quantity. So I need more to increase more the products. In my business plan, I would like to using the modern farming. Like in Australia, they use the free open range farming. So in Timor-Leste, many of people they use the traditional farming. So they don't using the modern farming because they have a lot of knowledge about the farming chicken.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I want to use this method because it can benefit for myself and my family, and we can improve the economic in my family.
Yeah. So and we often hear a lot about market development programs in development, and you see pictures of it, and it's great to talk to someone who started their business. Are you receiving any support from anyone in your business, or are you just using the money that you got from Australia. Are you getting support could be from AusAid or from UN to do the business,
Okay.
or the Timor-Leste government?
Yeah. Until now, I didn't have any support from any organization or any family. I just use the money that I earn from Australia.
Yeah.
And now I am participating in the social business credit from the program implemented from MTCI. I have done the business plan, facilitate from EAD, and now we'll finish soon, and now we'll complete the requisition from EAD, and I think next week I will submit to the EAD, and they will approve the proposal to the MTC, and I hope we will get the support from the MTA, and I think I will increase more the productivity of the chicken farming in the future.
That's great. Just to sort of for the audience that are not familiar with Timor-Leste, the organizations that Simon Pedro is speaking about are Timorese government agencies or departments that are helping out. So thank you for that. As I said to everyone else in the chat, if you've got questions for Simon Pedro, if you've got questions for Pedro, drop them in the chat. Cesarina, are you there? There was some uncertainty if you were there. Cesarina, are you there?
Yes.
I can hear a telephone. I don't know what that actually means. I think she's here. Cesarina, can you hear me? This is Washington calling. Okay, we'll see if she's we can get her on the line. This is like live radio. You got to be good at it. Hello, Cesarina, can you hear me? Okay, I think Cesarina's kind of sounds like there's a construction site. I'm going to talk to Jomat, and then I'm going to see if I can bring it back to Cesarina. So, Jomat, this question is going to make me sound like a really old man, because I'm not going to ask you a question about young people, and for that, which is it's some of the questions that we've got in the previous conversation, and some of the statistics that Michael put up and that Andrew put up talk about limited economic opportunities for youth in Timor-Leste. Limited economic opportunities for youth in Timor-Leste, which is why there's a tendency or a desire to leave. Can you talk about, from a kind of young person's, from a kind of youth perspective, the economic situation for a young Timorese trying to enter the labor market?
First, good morning and good afternoon, or even good evening to Lauren. Thank you, Mike, for having us here talking about our experience, especially in the seasonal worker. I'll basically touch on my perspective and also my experience of helping Timorese in the entrepreneurial journey for the past 4 years, as well as my sort experience being a seasonal worker. So my name is Jomat Tapal, to be shortened as Jomat, and I was once a seasonal worker myself in Canada, Perth. If everyone a little bit of a flu, I guess. So yeah, I graduated from high school into when I graduated, I applied. I would like to bring you on a little bit of joy how I get to seasonal worker. So I graduated high school, and in 2013, I immediately applied for a seasonal worker as well as some of the scholarship. And I was awarded a scholarship first-handed, so I even passed the seasonal worker, but the process itself took a while, and then I went ahead with my my scholarship. So I went to United States to do my associate degree. I was doing a business management in Belvic College in Washington State, and then for over 2 years. Coming back, I thought that I was already being blacklisted from the seasonal worker, and I immediately got a job at Timor Plaza. While working at Timor Plaza as an admin officer, I found out that my name still being active at the seasonal worker portfolio or platform that they have. So I had to like switch the idea of being a seasonal worker so that I could immediately open a business when coming back from Australia. That was a main drive that I would like to do. Well, that's why I quit my job at Timor Plaza and then went to Australia to do the seasonal work. Fast forward, and then I was in Australia for over 2 months, almost 3 months, 11 weeks for exact. And then the work itself was wonderful. I had a magnificent experience of working in the farm, picking, weeding, and those sort of activities that I did there. And yeah, quite a lot of, I would say in kind of a word, make a killing at the first phase of my arrival. Made a lot of money, 14 hours a day, and then $24 Australian dollar per hour. It was a great achievement, and we did a lot of hours until my 7th or 6th week, and then we ran out of job. That was unfortunate that everyone had, and we had to like pay all the deduction, everything, and we ended up coming back with a small amount of money, smaller than what expected. But
what are these deductions that you? These are the taxes, or these are something else, or?
The bonds for the first 3 months, unfortunately, you have a lot of deductions like a ticket, all the PPEs that the PPEs that company has prepared for you, your kind of some kind of package.
So hold on. So the company that you work for, that you had to pay for your personal protective equipment?
Yes.
Okay,
initially they prepare everything for you, and then they I mean, they initially put up front and pay for everything and prepare for us, so we had to like deduct it when we got our payment every week. So overall, I had a great experience of being a seasonal worker, and yeah, coming back.
I think Jomat's chopping in and out. Let's give him
now. I would like to.
Yeah.
Sorry. Can you hear me?
So yeah, I can hear you. So I've got a question. You're chopping in and out with the network. So we'll work with that.
So Cesarina was trying to find me, so I rejected because I was spotted from my.
Okay. Yeah. So maybe Cesarina's wondering when she I'm going to talk to Cesarina, and then we'll come back to you.
Definitely.
Jomat. Cesarina, can you hear me?
Cesarina?
She's playing hard to get. Can I ask you, Jomat, when I was a child growing up in Ireland, there was an expectation and almost certainly a dream that you would go overseas. And I like what Michael said earlier on, that sort of Ireland, Sicily, island countries, there's a kind of global connection. I feel intensely Irish, even though I haven't lived there for 25 years. For Timorese that are young Timorese today, is there a dream of going abroad, or is the preference to stay in Dili, stay in Timor-Leste?
To my experience, certainly a lot of youth these days wanted to go abroad, especially for earning money. It's not because of they want to live in a city or living in great places, but especially they want to earn money because abroad you will make a killing. It's a fortune for a lot of people. I come from a very, very remote area. Back then, we didn't have like, we have huts, like a lot of huts, houses are covered with bamboos or those things, but we have concrete houses. I mean, it's not like a great thing of having a great concrete houses in some other perspective of environmental issues, those kind of things. But to me, it's a great change of people being abroad. And I see a lot of youth. I'm working at this center. I have 100 youth in and out a day to access the opportunity to check opportunity being abroad, for instance, to learn Korean online or those kind of things. My center is big for youth, and people, a lot of people, even my siblings, we are trying to bring them abroad to at least earn, because the opportunity itself in Timor is very low. Even though I'm working towards of helping youth in entrepreneurship, like Mount Simon or other youth coming from Korea or other part of seasonal program or working abroad, or some of them who went on a scholarship and saved some money, come back to Timor, wanted to establish entrepreneurship, but the demand itself kind of a little bit low.
That's an interesting point. You're learning all these. You're learning all these skills, but there's not a space in the labor market or not a space in the economy to use those skills. I think Jomat's frozen again. I wonder if Cesarina is trying to give him another call. Pedro, you're on the line at a more stable internet connection. Can I ask you to talk about the actual sending money back? I do not want to know how much money you send back. If you want to talk about that, you're welcome. Just the act of sending money back. How do you send it? The ANZ Bank that used to be in Dili has closed. What's the mechanics? What's the process for sending money back?
Yes, ma'am. There is a many ways to sending money at the moment, and the hard thing is that we try to find the one who's fit best to us. Here, like if you're sending because sometimes our family only need maybe only need $100 or $200 just to pay the school for the kids. And if you send that amount of money, which is very, the amount is very small, and the tax is very high. So yeah, that's why we spend more money in the tax than actually we send money, and also the rate, because we're using the American dollar, and compared to Australian dollar, it's very the price is bad at the moment. And so that's what I said. Before, I think it's before the Australian New Zealand Bank in Timor, before. If there is any one of the bank of Australian bank can set it up again in Timor, I think that will be very helpful. That means you can send money or you can just transfer money between the account with very low cost, So yes. And also you cannot sending money, you cannot send a big amount in one day.
Yeah.
There is a limitation. So it's pretty hard now. It's pretty hard. But as you know, the money is really helpful back in Timor. If you want to do something, if you want if somebody offering something there that you want to buy, offering a land, or you want to buy, you want to keep it for the future, you cannot do it now because there is you cannot send that amount of money to buy the property. Sometimes, yeah, a week ago, there is some friend who comes to me and said, you're going to send a piece of land that I think is very good, very quite what do you call it? It's very good for the business in the future, you know. But we cannot because we cannot send that amount of money in one day, and the offer is gone and somebody took it, you know. Like in Dili, if you don't go and get it today, they go and sell it to any Bapa, any like bosses in Dili, you know. So that is.
Yeah. So you're in a lucky position because you have the money to be able to send it, but I have this issue as well right now, which is weird with the ANZ Bank in Australia. We're trying to send money to the United States at the minute, but there's a limit each day on how much you can send, and it means that you've got that for understandable financial transaction reasons, but it's some of these impacts, these everyday impacts are not that. And of course, the reason why the ANZ Bank closed down in Dili was probably to do with the economy. They weren't making enough money themselves in order to do it. Is Jomat and Simon Pedro there?
Yeah, we are back. Sorry for
okay, great. Okay, we're moving between countries and time zones. Can I ask you, if you look both at your experiences in Australia, you were there longer, Simon Pedro. What have you learned the most? What did you take away from the experience? What did you learn from working overseas?
Thank you once again. What did I learn from seasonal worker program? When I work in Australia, I learned a lot of in agriculture sector. Like I'm working pumpkin and melon farm. So I learned in Australia, the agriculture farming is more modern we compare in Timor-Leste, because the agriculture in Australia, they already use the technology for farming. But in East Timor, we still use traditional farming. So this is the difference in farm business in Australia and East Timor. And also, what is I gained from Australia is a good. When we work in Australia, you can get a good money, and when you come back to East Timor, you can help your family, and you can build some business, or you can do a better family life. I think this is the most important for us as a seasonal worker program.
Yeah, Jomat, I'll ask you that question about what did you learn, or what do you think was the big learning, maybe the most surprising difference you found? Then I've got two questions, both very good questions from Richard Curtin and Helen Hill, that I'll sort of ask the panelists. But in terms of you, what do you think what did you learn the most? I also apologize, my kids are screaming in the background, so that's the noise that you might be hearing.
To me personally, in terms of technology itself, the surprising thing when I was working as a seasonal worker, because back then I was freshly graduated from US, 5 months arriving in Timor-Leste, and I immediately went to work in Australia. It was kind of a time shift thing between living in this kind of environment, clean environment, and he went ahead on living in a very, very, very remote area in Kananara, where I couldn't even access to internet. That was an experience. But overall, in a way of a positive side, the technology, I couldn't just agree more with what Simon has shared. we learn a lot of how the technology they using of even an airplane to spray the bugs to the farms, and we were able to like have these cars roaming around and all sort of this giant like big farm. I was working with in a farm like as big as Dili, and we would like walk around with the car and then honking for birds to fly around. At that time, it was the first farming, and it was a wonderful experience, and a lot of using technology for picking, for weeding, sort of what we don't have here in traditional way of agriculture practices in Timor. And from there, I learned a lot of how we can turn subsistence agriculture in Timor-Leste into a viable commercial agriculture. As of my work right now, I've seen quite a lot of youth are working, doing businesses in agriculture, mainly in agriculture. And we see a lot of youths are returning to their home village to change the substance agriculture that parents have been doing for years and years into small, scalable commercial agriculture. I think that's what I have experienced.
Right. As is always what happens in these seminars, the good questions come in right at the end. It's like people trying to get into a bar at closing time. They're sort of getting in with the questions. I'm going to ask a question. I'm not really sure who wants to answer it. It's the question. There was a previous comment on the chat from a Sadhana Sen, which I thought was a really good one, which said, it would be really good to get a representative of the government on this panel, and I think that's a really good point. Sadhana, but one of the questions that Richard Curtin asked, maybe you can answer it, Jomat, is what do you think that the government of Timor-Leste could do to make it easier for Timorese to migrate overseas for work? So not what the government of Australia could do, but what could the government of Timor-Leste do to make it easier for Timorese to migrate overseas? Or is it not really their responsibility? Is that the responsibility of someone else, some other government?
Thank you very much for that. I would like to first of all thank the Australian government. As of recently, I've seen the changes the government of Australia has done for the changes in rules and regulations for employer in Australia to host the seasonal workers or PLS workers. And in the perspective of Timorese government, I think the recruitment itself has been conducted every year. A lot of people are in a waiting list and so on and so forth. And kind of in a political, I'm not like blaming, but somehow involving in political appointing people and so on. And it is not to blame, but to just point out some of the experience that people have shared along the way within the past 2 years or past 3 years of some would have tested in A+ in English and physically fit, but they haven't been able to get there. And some would be in a C or whatever it is, and they've got. It is kind of a mixture of political appointed people and this kind of way of not prioritizing who comes in the top priority, who comes first, or who is scoring well to be able to go there. But overall, the government in Timor-Leste are supporting all the seasonal workers. They have all the information out there for the Timorese to apply, to follow the step by step to finalize their documents, what are needed to be submitted, and sort of activities. And I believe if more in a concrete way of selecting people who should be gone first, and then prioritizing of having it all in a rational process so that people can go there. in addition, the government of Timor-Leste, representative of Timor-Leste in Australia should have explored more opportunities. I've heard from some of the friends in Australia, especially those seasonal workers, said that, oh, these some of the agencies or agricultural companies or hospitality companies wanted to hire more people, but our representative, like the embassy team, been able to reach them. And I feel like the work of the representative in Australia has to do more work in exploring more opportunities for Timorese, because a lot of Timorese are now in line. They all have been selected, but due to the lack of quota itself from Australia, and they haven't been able to go.
Yeah, I mean, there's a hard cap that Australia puts on this as well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do sort of two things. One, I'm going to formally close the meeting. And I want to thank everyone at the Development Policy Centre. I want to thank every one of our three panelists on this session and the previous panelists for their participation. Ari, who's been the sort of genius behind the scenes, is going to turn off the video now, and he's going to stop the live stream. We're going to keep on the Zoom for another 15 minutes. So if anyone would like to stay along and have, a more kind of free conversation, imagine this almost as being like the drinks at the end of a conference. Then we're happy. We're really happy to do that. But I just want to formally close the session now. Thank you to everyone for your participation. And we will stay on until it's 7:46 in the evening here. So we'll stay on for another 15 minutes and we'll close it at the top of the hour. But thank you very much to everyone. And like I said, don't feel obligated to stay, but if you'd like to stay for another 15 minutes, then please do. And I'm happy to fend some more questions for our wonderful three panelists. Thank you.